Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to In Depth. Voting has finished in Donetsk and Luhansk regions in referendums called by pro-Russian rebels to split from the rest of Ukraine. 90% of voters said they backed their region's sovereignty. However, polls the US slammed as illegal as the West threatens to spark civil war in the former Soviet Republic. Following the referendum, the Ukrainian army has begun an artillery bombardment of the eastern city of Slaviansk, which marks a serious deepening of the political crisis in Ukraine, which has pushed East-West relations to lows not seen since the end of the Cold War. To discuss the seriousness of the situation in Ukraine, we are joined by Mr. Cochrane. He is a freelance journalist based in Beirut. Hello and welcome, Mr. Cochrane, to In Depth.
Thank you.
The vote was organized by the Ukrainian federalization supporters, who have refused to recognize the legitimacy of the interim government of Ukraine. Can you explain to us the nature of this referendum? Is it for a self-independence or to join the Russian Federation?
The aim of it that was announced is that this is for autonomy, for an autonomous republic within inside of Ukraine, so they'd have their own federation, be able to decide on their own matters with seats and representation in Kiev. Whether that leads to then closer ties with Moscow is another matter, but it's showing that they want to be separate from Ukraine and decide on their own autonomy.
But what makes us sure that these regions will not join to the Russian Federation in the near future?
It's not totally clear whether they'll do that. I mean, there could be the possibility of a further referendum that will decide on that. But it's a sort of move where they're going to say, look, we're autonomous here. We don't want to be directly part of Ukraine, but we also don't directly necessarily want to be part of Moscow. But within the setup of the CIS, they could, as an independent or autonomous state within that, work with Moscow. So it can work sort of in both ways. And by doing this move, they could try and prevent actually a sort of civil war from happening, certainly in their region.
So by this move, do you think these regions will have their own government, their own parliament, and their institutions? They will be like a new republics?
Yeah, this is very much a possibility, certainly maybe when it comes to other parts of eastern Ukraine, who's saying, we are predominantly Russian speakers. We feel more Russian than we do Ukrainian. But then on a sort of pragmatic level, we want to keep Ukraine together. So let's have this as a more autonomous area where we can use Russian far more than Ukrainian. But that doesn't look like that's really going to happen. This is not what the West wants to happen or wants to let happen, as is clear in their statements from the elections over the weekend and what has been happening now elsewhere in the country. And it's a direct, obviously, a provocation against Russia, and they don't want further Russian influence.
I was reading many articles, and I found that 12% of Slaviansk are basically Jews. Do you think these people will, they will be positive regarding the separation or independence of this region?
They might very well be. I mean, considering that under the government that is in Kiev right now is a right-wing fascist party, and they have been going against Jews and other people, the undesirables. I mean, asking Jews to register their names and so forth. I mean, this reeks of the nasty, nasty periods under the Nazis 70, 80 years ago. And it's no wonder if they don't want to side with such a government.
But according to the international law, how legitimate are these referendums which are happening now in the eastern part of Ukraine?
Well, I mean, I think we need to look at even all the way back to February there with the coup that replaced the Ukrainian president with the current government that is there is under international illegal. It was a coup. It went against what is in the Ukraine's constitution. So for a start, in Kiev, they cannot legally claim and say that they're not allowed to carry out these referendums and so forth. And if an area of people decide to hold a referendum and it's internationally recognized and seen, then there's nothing illegal in that sense.
But how can we explain this weird alliance between the Western governments, which are liberal advocates for human rights, by allying themselves with fascist, rightist, and all these radical elements in Ukraine?
Well, those are the people that they could work with. I mean, over the past decade, the United States has provided about $5 billion to opposition groups within Ukraine because they wanted very much a pro-West, pro-Western Europe, pro-United States government there and have leverage against Russia.
But they said it's for pro-democracy purposes.
Which is basically propaganda. I mean, it's total doublespeak. And, this is where we can talk about this for hours. I mean, about throughout the rest of the world, where the United States has and the West has backed things for democracy, human rights, and so forth, and they've in many cases supported dictatorships and authoritarian regimes because it suits their geopolitical goals, which is the case here. This is why you're having some in Europe are concerned about it. But the way that the narrative and the story is being told to people is Russia is very much the bad guy here, and totally downplaying the fascist and neo-Nazi side of the government in Kiev right now.
But how can you describe the nature of the support, of the Russian support to the rebels in the eastern side of Ukraine? Is there any military support or financial or political cover? What kind of support Putin is providing them?
Well, I mean, Putin offered the ousted president $15 billion to come more into the Russian side. But on the sort of legal aspect, I mean, there were Russian troops already in Odessa. It's not in the Crimea. I mean, it's not like the Russians invaded. How can you invade if you're already there?
So there was any agreement between Ukraine and the
Yes, there was an
government?
agreement that goes back to the early 1990s, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, because Ukraine was a major military base for the Soviet military, as the first line, one of the first lines of defense or attack within Europe, and then Odessa being a major naval port. And Ukraine didn't want to be a sort of military power. It didn't have the money either, but Russia did, and they wanted to keep somewhere, and that was Odessa. And equally, looking back at history as well, like, I mean, that part of Ukraine was part of Russia till 1954. Only then did it accede and become part of Ukraine as an entity within the Soviet Union.
But critics are saying that now Russia is not different from the Americans, from the United States, because they are now invading other states, and they are encouraging the split or the independence, between quotations, of regions from eastern Ukraine and joining to Russia. So what makes Russia different from the United States? It's the same imperialism.
Except that it's exactly in their backyard. There has been historical precedents here. Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire at many points from the 18th century and for a long, long period of time up until the 1917 revolution. So there's historical arguments there as well. I mean, it would be, not dissimilar. I mean, if it was basically like the United States going to Mexico or Canada in that sense, it's right on its border. And I think it has to be viewed from a geopolitical perspective and historically as well, that Ukraine, being that border region between Europe and Russia. I mean, if Russia's going to be attacked, it's going to go through Ukraine. And so it's a key position. But it is acting in many ways like the US, but then the US is also wagging its finger, and it can't really do that either. I mean, there's a lot of hypocrisy.
So what is the strategy of Putin here? Like his long-term goal by encouraging the split and independence of these regions from Ukraine? What is his main purpose?
It's directed at NATO. It's to try and contain NATO within Europe, to not push further east, to not have more forces within Ukraine, but also within the Baltic states. It's a reassertion of Russian power, quite clearly. And it's also a direct snub, of course, to Europeans and the Americans, that, I mean, this is our backyard and we will operate here, and you don't have a say here, which is what is happening. And we're seeing how the Russians are essentially in a much stronger position than the Europeans, who are not very united on this issue, certainly when it comes to things like sanctions. And what military response is there? I mean, they've talked about it, but there's nothing overly clear, which I think is suggestive of a lack of almost a sort of strategy here by the EU.
But in your opinion, what is the importance of these two regions, Slaviansk and Odessa, for the Russians and for the Europeans?
Well, it's a big industrial zone, so I mean, economically it's an important area. But also it's being a warm water port, which is very crucial for Russia. And if that deal had ended between Ukraine and Russia, they would have been in a position where they don't have access to the sea, certainly to the Mediterranean area, which is very crucial. So that is one big aspect. But of course, tied within it, I mean, it's also about reasserting control within Central Asia and that area around there, which is extraordinarily rich in gas and natural gas and minerals.
Taking from what you said, what's the future of the gas pipelines of Russia, taking into consideration that there is a chaos now in Ukraine and civil war is going on in this area?
Well, no pipeline seems to have been hit yet, but I mean, this is what the Russians have over Eastern Europe as well. I mean, they can cut off the gas, and that is the big threat. And if the sanctions do increase against Russia. I mean, they have threatened to cut off the gas totally. And, I mean, countries in Europe are already trying to resource gas from other places. I mean, Latvia, for instance, is trying to look for the US to provide gas at discounted rates, because they get about 25% of their gas from Russia. And other countries, it's even more, and Ukraine as well. But the one aspect we didn't really mention, I mean, but why are some people in Ukraine not supporting the Kiev government? It's not just only that they're right-wing and neo-Nazis. It's also because Europe was forcing on Ukraine austerity measures and to do what the International Monetary Fund and everybody wanted. And they're looking at Greece and seeing, you know, 30% unemployment,
to Greece, to Portugal.
Economic situation in Greece and Spain, and they don't want to have the same, to do these structural adjustments and so forth that would plunge them into worse economic situation. And they look at Russia as well. Well, actually, maybe it would be better to not do these structural adjustments and side with Russia instead, from a purely economic point.
Did the Ukrainian government sign on any deals to get any loans from the IMF or any other banks?
Well, Europe was pushing on this, and the government that is in place in Kiev is looking aiming to get this, and it will need to do so because of the debt it's in.
Okay, we will continue our discussion, Mr. Paul Cochrane, but we have to take a break. Dear viewers, we have to take a short break. Don't go away, we will be right back.
Time. Variable. Event. The only constant variable in life is change. Broader perspective. Arguments and counter-arguments on our platform.
Global Insights. The globe on our platform.
The crisis of capitalism, the European impasse, the energy shortages, the emerging power of Asia, the economic power of the Arab world, the economic debate, informative, revealing, and progressive. It discusses the economic event of the world.
Economic debate, where the numbers reveal the truth.
Welcome back. We are discussing with Mr. Paul Cochrane the growing tensions in Ukraine and its repercussions on East-West relations. Mr. Cochrane, the pro-Western government of Kiev intensified its attempts to bring both regions back under its control by launching a military operations. Do you think the government of Ukraine is able to crush the rebellion on the eastern side of Ukraine?
I think it would be extraordinarily difficult for them to do so, and I think indicative of the lack of their ability to do it and how they're losing control in certain areas is that there was a report out in a German newspaper confirmed by German intelligence that there are 400 US mercenaries, members of Academy, which was formerly Blackwater, are there now operating within Ukraine on a security level, whether that be carrying out sniping operations to acting as a mercenary force and a sort of covert army.
Maybe also to train some
and also
Ukrainian
to train the
forces.
Ukrainians, yeah, and to do whether that's black operations, to anything else.
The White House now said that it is extremely concerned by the violence in southern Ukraine. It seems that the US is still insisting on a diplomatic path, diplomatic solution with the Russians. What options Obama has to deal with this boiling case?
I mean, the military situation is the sort of the area that no one wants to get to, because then we're going to talk about serious escalations of between two, and let's not forget, nuclear powers here as well. I don't think there's any appetite for this, And the West knows that it would be very difficult to take on the Russians, certainly in Ukraine. I mean, the Russians are supplied, obviously, by land, whereas for the European forces or NATO, it would be a much, much harder operation, which is just leaving, you know, hard diplomacy and trying to get Russia to the negotiating table. And they're trying to do that through sanctions, through targeting specific individuals and companies. And it's very much an opening up level where they're going targeted on certain individuals or banks, and then they'll expand the sanctions if they feel necessary, trying to make the main people involved hurt. And then if, you know, they see that that's not working, they would expand them even further to maybe trade embargoes.
Taking from what you said, France and Germany, they have taken more severe positions and threatened Russia to impose more sanctions if Ukraine's presidential elections, which will be held on May 25th, fails to go ahead. Do you think Moscow is planning to foil the elections in Ukraine, or they are interested in the success of these elections?
I think they're probably interested in the success of them. I mean, they're using the referendums that have already taken place as a form of legitimacy to show they are open elections and they've been carried out. There's a lot of reports that the elections are not being totally honest and there's been vote rigging and so forth. There's also been accounts that Russian special forces and intelligence have been operating within areas to gauge whether people really are pro-Russian or not, to see how the vote will go. But I think they're placing so much on this referendum, unless there are big, genuine external observers, not just EU observers, because I think in this case they're not actually going to be fully objective, because it's clear what the EU wants on this side. But EU policy is still, in many ways, all over the place. I mean, like, France is providing, as a deal, to sell billions of dollars of ships, naval ships, to Russia, and that operation and deal is still going ahead, despite the sanctions. And the sanctions, how they've been applied as well, because they were announced so far in advance, all those people that were sanctioned were able to move their money. So the sanctions have not really had the effect that they could have done. I mean, if you look at Libya, I mean, they announced the sanctions literally kind of overnight. So the next day, the accounts were frozen.
Yes.
In the case of the sanctions on these Russian individuals, no, they had weeks to, like, close their company or get the money out. So that has made it not very effective. And so now they're grasping at straws, like, what else can we do? We either impose major sanctions, but, you know, Germany and Britain in particular would stand to lose so much in trade and also money that's been invested, whether they're in Frankfurt or London as well, that they're caught here. They want to discipline Russia in that sense. They want to say you can't go any further or do any of this, but there's not so much that they can do. And the Russians are saying, well, okay.
So regarding the elections in Ukraine, do you think there is a man who would be a neutral man to come into power in Ukraine and solve all this problem, or the Europeans are insisting to install a pro-Western man who will be anti-Russian at the same time?
I think that's what the West want. They definitely want a pro-Western candidate. That's why they've thrown their backing in for the current government there, and they would very much like to see the current one win.
So if the Europeans are not able to impose more sanctions on the Russians, and they are not able to intervene militarily, what cards do they have in Ukraine beside installing a pro-Western government?
They don't. I mean, this is where maybe the mercenaries come in as well. That creates instability and trying to push people to not side with Russia, and because of the instability, okay, we'll side with the European Union. But I mean, I think you're left between a sort of rock and a hard place. I mean, you either side with Russia, or you side with the EU, and neither are sort of ideal options.
But instability is also, it will negatively influence the Europeans themselves, because they are paying the debts of Ukraine, and they need a fresh market and fresh economy in Ukraine in order to move on.
Yes, undoubtedly, and it has ramifications throughout the whole of Eastern Europe.
So how can you explain this policy? I mean, isn't this a very stupid policy by the Europeans?
It does seem very counterintuitive. It seems like a policy that has not been totally thought through, considering if they've been involved really for the last decade or so, or even longer, with trying to make an opposition in Ukraine that's genuinely sort of pro-Western. It's backfired, and this is what's resulted in this extraordinary sort of propaganda war that is going on. And it is very much like the Cold War, almost, with sort of hearing terms of the evil empire and the evil Russians and so forth. And then no mention, as we were saying earlier, no mention at all about this fascist neo-Nazi group, of which, I mean, the current Prime Minister is a neo-Nazi, but I mean, if you look at his website of his party, I mean, they show allied with NATO, also with things like Chatham House in London. So that's very indicative, I think, that he has the support of NATO, and he's going to push for this.
Mr. Cochrane, President François Hollande and German Chancellor Angela Merkel, they refused the referendum and considered it as illegal. How would the Western governments deal with the self-independence votings? Would they accept it as a de facto situation, or will countermeasures will be taken?
I think they won't accept it, and they will try and look into countermeasures. But what those measures could be, as we've been saying, I mean, with sanctions not really working and the military option not really there, what can they overly do? But then, if they're saying they're illegal, the government in Kiev is illegal too. I mean, it was a coup. It's not legal either. So, but that's not the narrative that's being told, of course. So what's happening in Ukraine is illegal all over the place. I mean, in fact, maybe the actual referendum that took place in Crimea is indicative and shows that there is genuine support. And the same that the election over last weekend, 89% turnout.
It's portrayed by the European states that it is a pro-democracy movement, as they are portraying it in Syria. I mean, there are Islamists here and neo-Nazis there, and they are still supporting these elements, which are basically anti-Western. They are against the values of the West for promoting human rights and also democracy in this region.
So, I mean, there you have it. I mean, with the West right now is backing neo-Nazi fascist groups in Ukraine. And then in Syria, they are backing Islamist jihadi groups that are against the West. It's a bizarre policy, and I mean, lots of us are discussing why this is and trying to understand this without getting all conspiratorial and so forth. I mean, but it's logically it doesn't make any sense.
Yes. As for the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, he said that there will be no further international talks on the Ukrainian crisis, and until and unless the government of Ukraine entered into a direct dialogue with the separatists in East Ukraine. Don't you think this is an impossible demand now after the referendums, to ask the government of Ukraine to engage into dialogue with the separatists?
No, I mean, and I think they have to as well. I mean, they're neighbors, and they're going to have to come to some kind of peace and negotiations, just whether it be on a trade level, I mean, let alone anything else. I mean, families are divided across one place and another. I mean, they can't be totally, we won't deal with them in any way at all. But there needs to be some kind of common ground here. And is that going to happen even through the United Nations, when Russia is a key member? I mean, and trying to kick Russia out of the G8 is maybe one way, but then Russia will just flex its muscles in another way. And, they maybe say, so what if we're not part of this club? You're quite clearly making it out that we're not welcome here. So we'll shift and change things. And I think politically and economically, we're seeing major tilts and shift now, potentially away from the West.
So are we going to witness like Geneva meetings, like what happened Geneva 1, Geneva 2, Geneva 3 for the Syrian crisis, but this time for Ukraine?
Yes, I think so. And I think what the West also wants to do is tie in the Ukraine issue with Syria even more. Particularly on sanctioning like Russian banks that they're claiming that the Assad regime is dealing with, which they came out and claimed last year, and then with no US or NATO invasion of Syria, those that died away. And then just in the last few weeks, they've been saying again, let's go for this. So I think these two files are going to get attached, which is going to make things even more complicated.
Mr. Cochrane, in a few words, what are the future scenarios in Ukraine? A civil war or foreign intervention to end this situation?
It's looking increasingly like civil war, and that is what is happening in many areas. You've seen a breakdown in law and order, and that's going to be used and manipulated by external forces, whether that is Russia pushing certain areas to side with Russia, and to Europe trying to push its own agenda there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Paul Cochrane. It was our pleasure to have you in depth.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was our show for tonight. Our thanks for watching. Assalamu alaikum.